Hi there, Alex here at mixinglessons.com. In this video, we're going to have a look at how to prevent the master fader in your DAW from clipping. So you might have noticed sometimes when you import a load of tracks, when you start to play them, even before you've changed any levels, added any EQ, any compression, sometimes that master fader at the end of your session can already be clipping, it's already overloading. And so in this video, I'm going to show you a simple way of how to prevent that happening. Before we get started, if you make music in a home studio, then be sure to get your hands on my free EQ cheat sheet, my free compression cheat sheet, and my free vocal recording guide. You can get all three at mixinglessons.com/free-downloads. Okay, so when you open up a session to start mixing, it's not uncommon for this to happen. Now I've got the sound turned down so that you can hear me talking over the top of this, but as you can see, already before we've adjusted any levels, the master fader has already clipped. So essentially what that means is we're sending too much signal to the master fader, so it's overloading. Now your instinct might be to turn the master fader down, so let's have a look and see what happens if we do that. And as you can see, the signal isn't overloading anymore, but I wouldn't recommend doing it this way, and I'll briefly explain why. Your master fader is a little bit different to the audio channels in your mix. So unlike these channels, if you load a plugin onto your master fader, let's say you add compression because you want to add some compression to the whole mix, the level of the signal that goes into this compressor is actually affected by the level of the master fader. So if you did all of your mixing with your fader down here and applied compression to the entire mix, and then later on you wanted to turn this channel up a little bit because you wanted the whole mix to be a little bit louder, then it would alter the level of the signal going into the compressor. So I'll briefly show you that. So let's set the compressor up so that it is applying some compression to the signal. Just dial it back a little bit. So there we're getting 1 or 2 decibels of compression. Now let's say further down the line we want to turn the master fader up. As you can see now, we're driving the compressor a lot harder, we're sending a lot more signal into the compressor. So I try to keep the master fader set to around 0, and then I usually find that if I do need to make any alterations to the level of the master fader, they're often quite small, whereas if I've maybe pulled that master fader down by 10 decibels or something, and then I have to turn it up by a larger amount, then it might mess up any settings that I've got on my compressor if I'm using one on the master fader. So if we're not going to stop the master fader overloading by turning down the master fader itself, how are we going to stop it from overloading? Well, the next thing you might think is I'll turn down the level of each of the channels. Let's have a look and see if that works. So as you can see, we've reset that clip light, and that has brought down the level of all of the signals that we're sending to that master fader. And so again, this does work, but I wouldn't recommend doing it this way. Now the reason for that is this. If we take a look at this fader, if we move this back up to 0, you'll see that if we make very small movements with the fader set at around the 0 mark, then if we look at these numbers down here, it tells us how much of a change we're making. We can make very, very tiny changes in tenths of a decibel. Whereas when we use the lower part of the fader, those small movements make a much bigger change. There, we're making a 3 decibel change by making about the same movement. Whereas if we go back up to 0, that small movement is making about a 1 decibel change. If you come right down here, if you look at the difference between 40 and 60, there's a 20 decibel change in a very small amount of space. Whereas up here, it's only a 5 decibel change in a much bigger space. So ideally we want to be working with the faders up nearer 0 because we can make much smaller and more specific changes than we can if we're working at the bottom end of the fader. So I've told you 2 ways not to do it. What is the way that we should do this? Well, what we need to do is we need to load a plugin. Your DAW should have something which might be called trim, or it might be called gain, something along those lines. And we need a plugin which will allow us to turn down the level of the signal on its way into the channel. So what we can do here is we can turn down the level of the signal as it's going into the channel. So it turns the signal down before it hits this fader. So what we'll do is we'll set each channel to -10 and we'll see what happens. So as you can see now, we've turned each channel down. Each signal is coming into the channel at a lower level and the master fader isn't clipping. And what this allows us to do is this allows us to work at the higher end of the fader rather than the lower end. It allows us to keep our master fader set around that 0 mark, which I feel is a little bit more efficient if you're adding compression to the entire mix or any other plugins to the whole mix. And it ensures that we're not sending so much signal to the master fader that it's overloading and clipping. Now, some people get quite specific about exactly what level they turn that signal down to. A lot of people aim for around a -18 decibel mark, and there is some logic to that. If you've got any plugins that you use that emulate older analog hardware, then they may have a sort of sweet spot around that point. Personally, that's not something I particularly worry about, so I tend to just set everything to -10 as a starting point and see what that gives me. Sometimes you'll have to turn 1 or 2 or maybe all of the signals down more if they've been recorded very hot. Sometimes that might turn things down a bit too much and you have to turn some channels back up. Just depends on what level your signals are at to begin with. But bringing things down by 10 decibels is a great starting point and then you can tweak from there. Now, different DAWs have different ways of doing this. There are other ways of doing this in Pro Tools, and I'm sure other DAWs have their own ways of doing this, but loading a plugin to turn down the level of the signal on the way into the channel is the most universal way that I've found where all DAWs will have some version of this. So I hope you found that useful. If you've got any questions, please leave them in the comments. Don't forget to get your free cue cheat sheet, your free compression cheat sheet, and your free vocal recording guide at mixinglessons.com/free-downloads. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.